All right. So as we work through some of these identities, they can be a little bit challenging to sort of get started. So there's really no sort of set way that you should start these problems, but I sort of have compiled a list of tips and tricks that are here for you that maybe will make things a little bit easier. These problems just sort of take some time to get used to, and once you start doing some of these, you'll be able to recognize where you should start, and what sort of your end result will look like. So, one of the most important things it says here, remember when verifying an identity, it's important not to treat the identity like an equation and to only work on one side of the equal sign at a time. So I'll let you read through number 1, 2, and 3. We'll start with number 1. So here's an example of number 1. It can be very helpful to work with things in terms of sine and cosine. So I'm just going to draw a vertical line here, and this is going to be equals cosecant x. And I'm going to mainly start working with the left-hand side of this equation because there's a lot more for me to work with there. So it's going to be a lot easier for me to make the left-hand side look like the right-hand side rather than sort of trying to figure out how I can manipulate cosecant to make it look like the other side of the equal sign. So the first thing that I'm going to do is use my tip of writing things in terms of sine and cosine. So I have cosine x times, I'll rewrite this as cosine x over sine x plus sine of x. So I'll end up with cosine squared x over sine of x plus sine of x. And the next thing that I want to do is create a common denominator, which you can see is actually here in step number 3, or I guess tip or trick number 3. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and multiply. I'll make this sine of x and sine of x. So I'll end up with cosine squared x over sine of x plus sine squared x over sine of x. And I'm just going to move over here for the sake of space. So I end up with cosine squared x plus sine squared x all over sine of x. And I know from my Pythagorean theorem identities that we derived in the previous lesson, cosine squared x plus sine squared x is actually just all equal to 1. So I'm left with 1 over sine x, which I know is the same as cosecant of x. So I went ahead and I started with everything that was over here on the left-hand side, and I ended up finally arriving at the right-hand side of my equation, or of my identity. So tip number 2 is the Pythagorean theorems can be used in more ways than one. So for example, sine squared x, cosine squared x is equal to 1, but I also know that I could subtract sine squared x from both sides, and I can subtract cosine squared x from both sides, and use those to your advantage. So here, what I want to go ahead and do is I'm going to, it looks like everything's already in terms of sine and cosine for me. You'll want to go ahead and make the error, or make the correction on here. There should be a subtraction sign in between here, so I just went ahead and rewrote the problem. And I'm going to start with another trick from number 3 up here. I'm going to start by factoring. So I can see that both of these terms have cosine x in them. So I am going to start by factoring out a cosine x, and I'm left with 1 minus sine squared x. And again, over on this side, I have my equals cosine cubed of x. And I know that 1 minus sine squared of x is the same thing as cosine squared x. So here I have cosine x times cosine squared x, which is going to give me cosine cubed x. And I have made my left-hand side match with my right-hand side. So I have verified the identity. So feel free to sort of always reference back to these little tricks right here. And remember, we're not treating it like it's an equation. Notice how here I didn't subtract sign x from both sides. So we're only working with one side of the equal sign at a time. So go ahead and take a look at the homework 48 from your text, and I hope that you find some of these tips and tricks helpful. Good luck, guys.